Before the story begins, make sure to like, subscribe, and let me know. What time do you usually watch videos? And don't forget to suggest the next story or content you'd like to see. Story 1. The Giggle Behind the Locked Classroom Door. It was a Friday evening in late October, the kind where the sun set too quickly and the hallways of the school darkened far earlier than they should have. I was a junior at a public high school tucked in the edge of town, and I had volunteered reluctantly to help clean up after the fall festival. Most of the student council had left already, their arms heavy with decorations and posters, but I had been tasked with returning a box of unused supplies to the storage closet on the second floor. The second floor of our building was quiet at night. The classrooms up there hadn't been in full use for years. Budget cuts and renovations meant that only a handful of teachers ever ventured into that wing anymore, and most of the rooms were left locked, unused. As I carried the box up the stairs, I remember thinking how eerie the place felt, especially compared to the bustle of the gymnasium just a few floors below. The hall stretched long and dim, lit only by the occasional flicker of fluorescent bulbs. The lockers were old and rusted in spots, and the tiles on the floor bore deep scratches from desks that hadn't been moved in decades. I tried to hurry, focusing on the sound of my sneakers squeaking faintly against the tiles. But as I neared the far end of the hallway, where the storage closet sat, I froze. From somewhere down the hall, unmistakable and sharp, came the sound of giggling. It wasn't just a single laugh. It was high-pitched, rapid, almost childlike, as if several students were laughing all at once, muffled slightly, as though they were just behind a wall. My first thought was that some other kids had stuck around, maybe playing a prank or messing around in one of the classrooms. But when I looked toward where the sound came from, I saw that every door was locked. Every classroom along that hall had its lights off, their windows dark. The laughter came again, louder this time, spilling into the hall like a wave. It sent a chill down my arms, the hair on the back of my neck bristling. Something about it didn't sound right. It wasn't the laughter of teenagers joking around. It was too synchronized, too repetitive, almost looping. I told myself I was being dramatic, that maybe the janitors had a radio on, or someone was watching something on their phone. Hugging the box of supplies tighter against my chest, I hurried to the closet and shoved it inside. I didn't want to linger, but just as I turned back toward the stairs, the laughter broke into a shriek. Not a scream, exactly. More like the laughter had shifted into something sharper, echoing off the walls with a piercing tone that made me flinch. It came from the last classroom on the left, room 214, which I knew for a fact had been locked since the start of the school year. Against my better judgment, I crept closer. The door to 214 was padlocked, a heavy chain looping around the handle, but as I reached it, the giggling abruptly stopped. Silence filled the hall, heavy and suffocating. I could hear my own breathing, too loud in the stillness. I stood there, staring at that locked door, debating whether to run. Then, faintly, so faintly I almost thought I imagined it, I heard the sound again. This time it wasn't laughter, it was whispering. Several voices, hushed, murmuring, blending together like a chorus behind the door. I couldn't make out words, but they rose and fell, rising into a swell that ended in yet another burst of that eerie collective giggling. My legs trembled. I backed away, step by slow step, until I was halfway down the hall. That's when the sound changed again. The laughter didn't stay confined behind the door anymore. It echoed down the hall, surrounding me, bouncing from wall to wall as if invisible children were darting just out of sight. I ran. By the time I reached the stairwell, my breath was ragged and my chest ached. I slammed into the double doors and barreled down into the safer, brighter parts of the school. The gym was still alive with the last few stragglers of the festival cleanup, and when I tried to explain what I'd heard, everyone just laughed it off. "Old buildings make weird noises," one of the teachers told me. "You've just been spooked by the dark." But I knew what I heard. That night, I couldn't sleep. The laughter replayed in my mind like a broken recording, looping endlessly. By morning, I convinced myself it had been a trick of the acoustics, or maybe even some prank by kids who knew how to get into the locked rooms. Still, I needed to be sure. The following Monday, I came back early before first period and went upstairs to the second floor. The hall was silent, just as I expected, and room 214 stood locked with the same chain and padlock. I leaned down to peer through the narrow window in the door. The classroom inside was barren. No desks, no chairs, just dusty floors and a chalkboard cracked down the middle. I almost felt silly for scaring myself. But just as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. On the inside of the chalkboard, written faintly in white, were words I swear hadn't been there before. "Do you hear us laugh?" I froze. My stomach flipped as I stepped back, staring at the message. The chalk lines were jagged, as though written by several hands at once, overlapping in places. I wanted to believe it had been written ages ago, a leftover prank from some student decades before. But the chalk looked fresh. From that day on, I avoided the second floor whenever I could. Still, the rumors grew. I wasn't the only one who heard it. Other students whispered about laughter in that hallway, about footsteps when no one was there, about whispers that followed them until they reached the stairs. The janitors swore the rooms were empty, always locked, and yet sometimes when they passed by, they heard the sound of chairs scraping against the floor or a child's voice calling faintly for help. One of the older teachers finally explained it. Years ago, in the late 70s, room 214 had been used as a homeroom for a small class. The story went that a fire broke out in the science lab down the hall, filling the wing with smoke. Most of the students escaped, but several had been trapped in room 214. They pounded against the locked door, screaming and laughing in panic, but the firefighters couldn't reach them in time. By the time the flames were out, the room was silent. I don't know if that story is true or just another legend, but the thought of it made the laughter I'd heard feel darker, less playful. Maybe the giggles weren't joyful at all, but a distorted echo of something far more terrifying. To this day, whenever I walk past the stairwell that leads to the second floor, I feel a cold breeze drift down, carrying with it the faintest sound. And if I listen too closely, I swear I can hear it again. Laughter. Soft and distant, spilling from behind a locked door that should remain sealed forever. Story 2. Midnight laughter in my grandmother's abandoned house. My grandmother's house stood at the edge of a lonely field, a crumbling 2-story structure that hadn't seen life in years. It had been abandoned since her death, left to rot beneath the weight of ivy and peeling paint. My family always avoided it. Too many bad memories, too much money required to fix it. Yet for some reason, I couldn't stay away. There was something about that place that tugged at me, a mix of nostalgia and unease. As a child, I'd spent summers there. The house had always been creaky, the floorboards sighing beneath every step, and the upstairs hallway smelled faintly of mothballs and dust. But it was my grandmother's laughter that gave the house its warmth. She had a laugh that filled the rooms, deep and full, the kind that could make you feel safe no matter what. When she passed, the house became something else entirely. The curtains sagged in the windows like heavy shadows, and the once bright wallpaper began to curl. I remember standing at the edge of the field years later, staring at the sagging porch, wondering why it felt so much colder than I remembered. That's when the laughter started. It happened the first time I decided to stay overnight. I had convinced myself that one evening inside the house would settle my unease, that I'd finally see it for what it was. Just an old, forgotten building. Armed with a flashlight, a sleeping bag, and more courage than sense, I stepped through the warped wooden door. Inside, the house smelled of mildew and earth, as though the ground had crept up through the floorboards. My footsteps echoed strangely, louder than I expected, as if the house were emptying itself of sound and giving mine back twice over. I walked through the room slowly, letting my flashlight dance across the peeling wallpaper, then at the cracked mirrors, the sagging furniture draped in white sheets. Night fell quickly. I set up in the living room, where I remembered playing with toy blocks on the rug while my grandmother watched from her rocking chair. The chair was still there, covered in a sheet, the wooden runners peeking out like pale bones. I unrolled my sleeping bag and lay down, listening to the wind whistle faintly through broken window panes. It was quiet for hours. Too quiet. The kind of silence that presses against your eardrums, making you aware of every beat of your heart. I drifted in and out of a shallow sleep, clutching my flashlight, until sometime past midnight, I woke to a sound. Laughter. At first, I thought I was dreaming. It was faint, muffled, like someone chuckling from the far end of the hallway upstairs. My heart tightened. I sat up, holding my breath, listening. The sound came again, a soft, low laugh, unmistakably human. I told myself it was the wind, or maybe an animal, but deep down, I knew better. The sound was too deliberate, too familiar. It was my grandmother's laugh. I remembered it instantly, the way it used to rise in little bursts before spilling over into something fuller. I felt a sick twist in my stomach. She'd been gone for years, and yet here I was, listening to her laugh in the dead of night in a house that hadn't seen life since her funeral. The laugh grew louder. It seemed to roll down the stairs, echoing against the walls, as though whoever was laughing was making their way toward me. My flashlight shook in my hand as I aimed it at the staircase. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but the steps were empty. Still, the laughter didn't stop. It circled me now, filling the room, bouncing from corner to corner like there were dozens of voices instead of one. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it didn't matter. The sound was inside my head, crawling into my skull. "Grandma?" I whispered, not knowing why. The laughter stopped instantly. The silence was worse. The house seemed to hold its breath with me, the stillness pressing against my skin. I thought maybe it was over, that I had imagined everything, but then I saw the rocking chair. It moved. Slowly, the sheet draped over it shifted as the chair began to rock back and forth. Back and forth. The legs creaked against the floor in a steady rhythm, and then, beneath the sound of wood scraping, I heard it again. A laugh, low and wet, like someone gurgling out a joke only they understood. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I sat frozen, staring at the chair as the sheet slid off, revealing the worn wood. The chair rocked harder now, violently, as if someone unseen had thrown their weight into it. And from upstairs, more laughter erupted. Dozens of voices, children and adults, all laughing together, rolling down the walls like thunder. I scrambled out of my sleeping bag, heart pounding. I bolted for the door, fumbling with the lock, but it wouldn't budge. Behind me, the laughter grew so loud it shook the glass in the windows. The rocking chair slammed against the floor over and over until I thought it would splinter apart. Then, clear above it all, I heard her voice. My grandmother's voice. Stay. It was sharp, almost a command, nothing like the warm woman I remembered. The laughter around me stopped all at once, cut off like a record needle scratched from vinyl. My breath came in shallow gasps, my hands still clutching the doorknob. Then, just as suddenly, the door gave way and I stumbled into the cold night air. I didn't stop running until I was halfway across the field. When I turned back, the house stood in silence, dark and still, as though nothing had happened. I swore I'd never return, but that wasn't the end of it. Weeks later, I started hearing it again, in my own home. At night, when the house was quiet, I'd wake to faint giggling from the corner of my room. Sometimes it was just one voice, low and raspy. Other times, it was a chorus of laughter, swelling until I felt like the walls might crack. Once, I swore I saw the outline of the rocking chair in the shadows, swaying gently, though it wasn't really there. I've tried to ignore it, but the truth is, the laughter follows me. It doesn't belong to the house anymore. It belongs to me. And sometimes, in those rare moments when I can force myself to listen without screaming, I realize something awful. It isn't just my grandmother's laugh anymore. It's mine too, echoing back at me in the dark as though I've already joined the chorus. Story 3, the party that never happened in room 6B. There was always something strange about room 6B. In middle school, it sat at the far end of the old wing, past a stretch of hallway that most students avoided unless absolutely necessary. The rest of the classrooms were filled with chatter, clattering desks, and the chaos of adolescence. But 6B was different. The door was always closed, the blinds always drawn. Teachers said it was used for storage or special meetings, but none of us ever saw anyone go in or out. The rumors started early. Some kids swore the room had been sealed after an incident years before, though no one could agree on what had actually happened. One story claimed a fire had broken out during a party thrown by students after hours, trapping kids inside. Another rumor whispered of a substitute teacher who lost his mind and locked his class in there. Others simply said it was cursed. I didn't believe any of it, at least not until the night I heard the laughter. It happened during my 8th grade year, on the evening of the winter dance. The gymnasium was glowing with strings of lights, and the music thumped loud enough to rattle the trophy cases. I wasn't much of a dancer, so after an hour of awkward swaying and avoiding eye contact, I slipped out into the hall for some air. The school felt different at night. Too big, too empty. My sneakers squeaked softly against the waxed floors as I wandered further, letting the music fade behind me. I wasn't paying much attention until I turned a corner and froze. From down the hall, I saw it. The door to room 6B standing wide open. That was strange enough, but what made me stop cold was the sound spilling out from it. Laughter. Not one laugh, but dozens. High-pitched giggles, low chuckles, the sound of kids talking over one another, clinking glasses, even the faint swell of music. It was the unmistakable hum of a party in full swing. Curiosity overpowered fear. I crept closer, each step echoing against the empty lockers. As I reached the doorway, I peered inside and felt my stomach drop. The room was alive. Colorful streamers hung from the ceiling, balloons bobbed against the walls, and the floor was crowded with dancing figures. Kids my age twirled and laughed, their faces flushed with excitement. The air shimmered with energy, the kind that only comes from being young and reckless. But none of them were familiar. I scanned the crowd, expecting to see classmates from the gym, but these kids were dressed strangely, in styles that looked decades old. Baggy sweaters, plaid skirts, Letterman jackets yellowed with age. Their haircuts didn't match anything I'd ever seen at school. It was like I'd stepped into another time. The strangest part was the way none of them seemed to notice me. I stood in the doorway, staring, and not a single head turned. They laughed and spun and bumped shoulders as if I weren't there. I took one step inside. The air hit me instantly, warm and stale, tinged with cigarette smoke and something sweet, like old punch. The laughter surrounded me, too loud, too bright, pressing against my ears. I should have run, but I didn't. Instead, I walked further, drawn in by the surreal energy of the place. Near the back wall, a group of kids sat on desks pushed together, sharing a joke. One boy leaned back, laughing so hard tears streamed down his cheeks. I stared at him, my chest tightening, because there was something off about his face. The way his mouth stretched. It was too wide, his teeth too many. When he laughed again, the sound warped, like a tape played too fast. I stumbled back, suddenly aware that the laughter around me was changing. What had seemed joyful moments before was now sharper, harsher. The giggles twisted into cackles, the chuckles into guttural howls. I looked around wildly, and that's when I realized the kids weren't dancing anymore. They were staring at me. Every single one of them had stopped mid-motion. Their heads turned in eerie unison, eyes locking on me. The music still played, but distorted, warped like it was underwater. My skin crawled as dozens of grins widened, mouths stretching far too much for human faces. I bolted. I ran for the door, shoving past a girl whose hand grazed my arm. Her touch was ice cold, and when I glanced back, her eyes were hollow, black pits that reflected nothing. The laughter followed me, swelling louder and louder, chasing me down the hall as I sprinted toward the gym. When I finally burst back into the light and noise of the dance, I doubled over, gasping for breath. My friends crowded around, asking where I'd been. But when I turned back toward the hallway, the door to 6B was shut tight, the corridor dark and empty. I never told anyone that night. But it didn't end there. Over the following weeks, I started hearing it again. The laughter. Sometimes faint, drifting down the hallway when I stayed late for after-school clubs. Other times it was sharper, echoing from behind the closed door of 6B when I walked past. No one else seemed to hear it. Teachers dismissed it, brushing me off when I asked why the room was locked. One afternoon, curiosity got the better of me. I pressed my ear against the door of 6B. At first, nothing. Then, faintly, the sound of clinking glasses and muffled giggles. My blood ran cold. I pulled back, only to see something that made me stumble. On the window of the classroom door, so dusty no one could see through it, I saw a handprint. Fresh, pressed against the glass from the inside. That was enough for me. I avoided that end of the hall for the rest of the year, no matter how many detours it took. By the time I moved on to high school, I thought I'd left room 6B behind. But the memory followed me. Years later, out of morbid curiosity, I looked it up. buried in old archives, I found a newspaper clipping dated from the late 70s. A headline that made my stomach lurch: Tragedy at Lincoln Middle. Unauthorized after-hours party ends in fire. According to the article, a group of students had broken into the school one night to throw a party in room 6B. Something went wrong. Faulty wiring, faulty lights, no one knew. A fire broke out, and by the time anyone discovered it, the room was engulfed. Several students died, trapped inside. The names and faces printed in that article matched the ones I had seen that night. The same kids in the Letterman jackets, the same plaid skirts, the same boy with the too wide smile. And the worst part? At the bottom of the article, under the grainy photos of the victims, I saw the girl who had touched my arm. She was smiling in the picture, her eyes bright and alive. Now, sometimes when I'm alone at night, I hear it again. Not loud, not close, just faint giggling, drifting from down a hallway that isn't there. A party that never ended, in a room that should never have been opened. Story 4. Children's laughter beneath the church basement. The church stood on the edge of town, a weathered stone building with a leaning steeple that cast long shadows across the graveyard beside it. St. Augustine's had been there for over a century, though by the time I came across it, few people still attended. My aunt, a devout woman, dragged me along on Sundays when I stayed with her. I was 16, restless, and the sermons bored me to tears. But what unsettled me wasn't the priest or the dwindling congregation. It was the basement. The church basement was a cavernous, cold place where Sunday school had once been held. Rows of tiny chairs and long tables were stacked neatly against the damp stone walls, covered in dust. The fluorescent lights buzzed and flickered, and the smell of mildew hung heavy. The children of the parish no longer came down here. The church claimed they'd moved classes to a different building after a pipe leak ruined the basement floor. But to me, it always felt like the church was hiding something more. The first time I heard it was during one of those endless Sunday services. My aunt had nodded off beside me, her head bobbing toward her chest, when a faint sound drifted up through the floor. It was subtle, almost like wind. But then it came again, higher, sharper. Laughter. Children's laughter, rising from somewhere below our feet. I sat upright, heart thudding. No one else reacted. The priest droned on. The few parishioners coughed politely, but I heard it clearly. A chorus of small voices giggling, as though a classroom of children was playing directly beneath us. After service, I asked my aunt about it. She frowned, brushing the question aside. "The basement's closed off," she said firmly. "Don't go down there." Of course, that only made me more determined. That evening, while my aunt lingered chatting with the priest, I slipped away and found the basement door near the back of the church. It was locked, but the wood was old, the latch brittle. With a little force, it gave way. A cold draft rushed up to meet me, carrying with it the smell of earth and something faintly metallic. I crept down the narrow staircase, my footsteps echoing too loudly. The light switches on the wall didn't work, but my phone flashlight illuminated the stone steps and the wide room below. The basement was exactly as I remembered. Tables stacked, chairs tucked in neat rows, a chalkboard propped against one wall. Dust floated in the beam of my light, disturbed by the draft. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, from the far corner of the basement, came a giggle. I froze, my stomach tightening. It was a child's laugh, clear and bright, completely out of place in the damp, empty space. "Hello?" I whispered, though I don't know why. The laugh came again, joined by another, then another. Soon the room was alive with it, dozens of children laughing in the dark. The sound bounced off the walls, filling the empty basement with joy that felt wrong. It wasn't playful. It was too loud, too overlapping, like the voices were competing to drown each other out. My phone's flashlight flickered. In the dim beam, I thought I saw movement, small shapes darting between the stacks of furniture, shadows that seemed too quick, too short to be tricks of the light. I backed toward the stairs, pulse racing. But before I could climb, something scraped across the stone floor behind me. Slowly, I turned. One of the tiny chairs had shifted. It stood in the center of the room now, facing me. And sitting in it was the faint outline of a child. Not solid, more like smoke shaped into a form, its head cocked slightly, its shoulders shaking with silent laughter. As I stared, more shapes flickered into existence. Dozens of them. Small children, Smoky outlines filling the room, sitting on the chairs, crouched on the floor, their mouths open in soundless giggles that soon rose again, filling my head until I thought I'd burst. I bolted. I scrambled up the stairs 2 at a time, slamming the basement door shut behind me. My aunt spotted me instantly, her face pale. She didn't ask what I'd seen, only grabbed my wrist and dragged me to the car. On the drive home, she finally spoke. "You shouldn't have gone down there," she whispered. Her hands gripped the steering wheel so tight her knuckles whitened. "They're not children anymore." I pressed her for answers, but she refused to say more. Weeks passed, but the sound of that laughter haunted me. I couldn't sleep, always expecting to hear it under my floorboards. Sometimes, late at night, I swore I heard it faintly, distant and muffled, like it had followed me home. Eventually, I found the truth, or at least the pieces of it. In the library's archives, buried in brittle newspapers, I found an article from the 1950s. The headline was small but chilling. "Tragedy at St. Augustine's. Basement collapse claims 23 children." The article described how the basement floor had given way during a Sunday school class. The weight of the children, the rotted supports, the old construction, everything combined into disaster. The floor collapsed, trapping the kids beneath the stone and timber. Many suffocated before rescuers could reach them. I felt sick. The number 23 children echoed in my head. That was about how many voices I'd heard laughing. I confronted my aunt, shoving the article in front of her. She refused to look at it. "The church doesn't talk about it," she said flatly. "We pray for their souls, but we don't disturb them." "Then why are they laughing?" I demanded. "Why not crying? Why not screaming?" She closed her eyes, her voice trembling when she finally answered. "Because they don't know they died. To them, it's still class, still playtime. They laugh because they never grew up enough to realize what happened." Her words hollowed me out. Now, years later, I avoid that part of town altogether, but sometimes in quiet places, libraries, chapels, even basements, I hear it again. That chorus of giggles, light and bright, echoing faintly through the floor. And each time, I wonder if it's just an echo of the past, or if those children are still waiting, trapped beneath stone, forever laughing in the dark. Story 5, the hotel hallway that echoed back a laugh. I've stayed in more hotels than I can count. Business trips, family vacations, weekends away, sterile hallways and identical rooms have been a forgettable blur most of my life. But one stay, years ago, etched itself into me so deeply that I've never been able to step into a hotel without feeling a chill crawl across my skin. It was the spring of my sophomore year in college. I'd driven 5 hours to attend a small academic conference in another city. My budget was thin, so instead of staying at the chain hotel with my classmates, I booked a cheap room at an older place on the edge of downtown. It wasn't run down, exactly. It had once been glamorous, a relic of the 1950s, with ornate chandeliers and patterned carpets that smelled faintly of dust. The kind of hotel that had clearly seen better decades. The front desk clerk was polite but distant, sliding me a brass key attached to a heavy fob with the number 417 engraved. My room was on the 4th floor. The elevator creaked as it carried me up, the carpet frayed, the mirrored walls smudged with fingerprints. When the doors opened, I stepped into a hallway that stretched long and empty, lined with identical doors. The lighting was dim, just a row of wall sconces glowing weakly against faded wallpaper. As I walked toward my room, I became aware of the silence. Hotels are never truly quiet. There's always the murmur of televisions, the shuffle of feet, the slam of doors. But here, the hallway was completely still, as if I were the only guest on the floor. My footsteps echoed faintly against the patterned carpet, too loud, too solitary. I unlocked room 417, dropped my bag, and tried to shake off the unease. The room itself was standard enough. Double bed, dresser, a small bathroom with peeling tiles. Outdated, yes, but clean. I convinced myself I was just tired from the drive. The first night passed uneventfully. I attended the conference sessions the next day, mingled with classmates, and returned late in the evening. By then, the hotel seemed quieter than ever. The lobby was deserted, the front desk unmanned. When the elevator doors slid open on the 4th floor, I stepped out into silence so heavy it felt like a blanket pressing down on me. I made it halfway down the hallway when I heard it. Laughter. It was faint at first, almost like the distant sound of a television left on in someone's room. But as I slowed, it grew clearer. High-pitched, sharp, unmistakably human laughter. I turned my head, trying to locate it. The sound seemed to come from further down the hall, near the end where the corridor turned sharply left. But something about it was wrong. The laugh didn't fade in and out like normal. It was steady, echoing, as though bouncing back against the walls. I stood frozen, listening. Then, on instinct, I let out a nervous chuckle of my own. Just a short, awkward laugh to test the sound. Immediately, the hallway answered back. My laugh echoed down the hall, but it wasn't quite right. The sound that came back was delayed, distorted, stretched into something shriller, almost mocking. It was like someone had taken my laugh, twisted it, and sent it back at me. My throat went dry. I told myself it was just the acoustics, that old buildings did strange things with sound. I hurried to my room, locked the door, and tried to ignore the knot of fear in my chest. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the pipes, every hum of the old radiator set my nerves on edge. Around 2 a.m., I sat up in bed, straining my ears. For a while, there was nothing. Then, faintly, it came again. Laughter. This time, it was right outside my door. I shot out of bed, heart hammering. The laugh was soft, childlike, a giggle that rose and fell like someone playing. I held my breath, pressing my ear to the door. The sound stopped instantly. The silence was so complete it rang in my ears. I backed away slowly, retreating to the bed. I told myself I was imagining it, that stress and exhaustion had finally gotten to me. Eventually, I drifted into a restless sleep. The next morning, I tried to bring it up casually to the desk clerk. "Hey," I said, forcing a smile, "is there a family with kids staying on the 4th floor? I thought I heard some laughing last night." The clerk frowned. "4th floor?" He flipped through his logbook. "You're the only guest we have on that floor." The words sent ice through me. That evening, I returned reluctantly to my room. The hallway seemed longer than before, the shadows deeper. I kept my eyes fixed on the door to 417, trying not to glance down the corridor. But as I slid the key into the lock, I heard it again. A laugh. This time, it was low, adult, throaty. It rolled down the hall, bouncing from wall to wall, until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. My hand shook on the key, but I forced the door open, slammed it shut behind me, and bolted the lock. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every hour, on the hour, the laughter returned. Sometimes high-pitched, sometimes deep, sometimes so many voices overlapping that it sounded like a party happening just beyond the walls. And always, when I tried to test it with a nervous laugh of my own, the hallway echoed it back. Twisted, cruel, wrong. By the 3rd day, I couldn't take it anymore. I skipped the last conference session, packed my bag, and went to check out early. As I handed back the heavy brass key, I finally asked the question that had been burning in me. "Has anything ever happened here? On the 4th floor?" The clerk's polite mask slipped. His eyes darted away. "We don't talk about that," he muttered. I pressed. He hesitated, then leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Years ago, back when this place was still busy, a guest lost his mind. Middle of the night, he wandered the hallway on the 4th floor, laughing to himself. Just laughing, over and over, waking up the whole wing. By morning, he was gone, vanished. No one ever saw him leave." The clerk snapped the logbook shut. Best not to dwell on it. I left without another word. Even now, years later, I can still hear it if I think too hard. That mocking laugh, bouncing back at me from an empty hallway. Sometimes in new hotels, I test it, let out a little laugh in the silence, just to see. And every so often, the silence answers. Not with my laugh, not exactly, but with something close, too close. Laughter is supposed to be comforting, a sign of warmth, joy, and life. But when it comes from nowhere, when it echoes in spaces that should be silent, it takes on an entirely different meaning. These stories remind us that even the most familiar sounds can twist into something chilling when they don't belong. So the next time you hear laughter in an empty room, listen closely, because it may not be as harmless as it seems.